Welcome, dear listeners, to Killer on the Seaside Bandstand, a Miss Marple mystery. Settle in with a cup of tea as we journey to the charming village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s, where secrets hide behind lace curtains and afternoon teas. This cozy tale of intrigue, penned in the spirit of Agatha Christie, follows the sharp-eyed Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzling murder. Our story unfolds over 10 chapters, each about 8 to 10 minutes when read aloud. For your convenience, chapter timestamps are included. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Melody of Murder. The sun hung low over the English coast, casting a golden glow across the village of St. Mary Mead, where the cliffs met the whispering waves of the channel. It was the summer of 1952, and the air carried the mingled scents of salt, blooming hydrangeas, and freshly baked scones from the tea room on the promenade. St. Mary Mead, with its thatched cottages, winding lanes, and a church spire piercing the sky, was the sort of place where time seemed to pause, where neighbors greeted each other with a nod and a smile, and where the rhythm of life followed the gentle ebb and flow of the tides. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, currents of human nature, ambition, envy, love, and resentment ran as deep as the sea itself. On this particular evening, the village had gathered at the Seaside Bandstand for its annual summer concert, a tradition as cherished as the vicar's Sunday sermons. The bandstand, a Victorian relic of wrought iron and weathered wood, stood proudly on the promenade, its domed roof painted a faded duck-egg blue that gleamed softly in the twilight. Ornate scrollwork curled around its railings, and a low wooden stage, scuffed by decades of performances, held pride of place at its center. Around it, flower beds burst with pink and purple hydrangeas, their petals swaying in the breeze like dancers awaiting their cue. The bandstand overlooked the pebbled beach, where waves lapped rhythmically, and beyond, the cliffs rose in jagged silhouette against the horizon. It for village happenings was as sharp as the needles in her lap. Beside her sat Dolly Bantry, her dearest friend, and a woman whose robust cheerfulness contrasted Miss Marple's quiet reserve. Dolly, with her rosy cheeks and penchant for bright scarves, was the widow of Colonel Bantry, and her gossip was as reliable as the church clock. "Isn't it a splendid evening, Jane?" Dolly said, fanning herself with a concert program. "The band's in fine form, and the hydrangeas, my, they've outdone themselves this year." "Quite splendid," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes drifting to the bandstand. "Though I dare say the conductor's enthusiasm is the true spectacle." The conductor, Mr. Reginald Hargrove, was a portly man in his 50s, his waxed mustache quivering with each flourish of his baton. Dressed in a slightly frayed tailcoat, he stood at the center of the bandstand, commanding the St. Mary Mead brass band with the gusto of a maestro at Covent Garden. Hargrove was a local figure of note, admired for his dedication to the band and his knack for coaxing music from even the most reluctant cornet player. Yet, whispers followed him like shadows. His temper could flare like a summer storm, and his finances were rumored to be as unsteady as the cliffs after heavy rain. Some said he had debts, others that his charm masked a ruthless streak. Miss Marple, who had observed him over cups of tea at village fêtes, noted his habit of glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting trouble to creep up unannounced. The band, a motley assembly of villagers ranging from the baker's apprentice to the retired postmaster, played with more heart than precision. Their rendition of Greensleeves had a certain rustic charm, and as the notes floated over the crowd, children darted between chairs, their laughter mingling with the music. The audience, seated on blankets or folding chairs, clapped politely, though some exchanged knowing glances when the trombone hit a sour note. Among them were familiar faces. Mrs. Price Ridley, the motion. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Curious, she murmured to herself, though Dolly, distracted by a child chasing a runaway balloon, did not hear. The concert reached its crescendo, the brass swelling in a triumphant finale. Hargrove waved to the crowd, his mustache twitching with a grin. Then, as the final note lingered, he reached for his flask once more. He took a deeper swig, his throat working visibly. For a moment all seemed well. Then his eyes widened, his hand flew to his collar, and a choking gasp escaped his lips. The baton slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the wooden stage. Before the crowd could register the sound, Hargrove's knees buckled, and he collapsed in a heap, his tailcoat splaying like a fallen curtain. A hush fell, broken only by the distant crash of waves. Then came a scream, Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching her program to her chest. The crowd surged forward, a mix of gasps and murmurs rising like a tide. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through, his medical bag swinging at his side. A wiry man with a no-nonsense air, he knelt beside Hargrove, loosening the conductor's collar and pressing fingers to his wrist. The band faltered, instruments trailing off in discord. Lionel Baxter dropped his trumpet, his face pale, while Eliza Thorne stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly. Dr. Haydock looked up, his expression grim. "He's gone," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Dead." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Dolly Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, what on earth? He was fine a moment ago." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She leaned forward, studying the scene. Hargrove's crumpled form, the flask glinting beside him, the faint bluish tinge around his lips. Dr. Haydock sniffed the flask cautiously, then recoiled, his face tightening. "Cyanide," he muttered to a nearby constable who had arrived panting from the village station. "Poison, no doubt about it. They bloom brightly, but their thorns are often hidden until one pricks a finger." As the constable called for order and Dr. Haydock covered Hargrove's body with a blanket, the bandstand stood silent, its cheerful blue dome now a backdrop to tragedy. The sea whispered on, indifferent, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, as if counting the threads of a mystery only she could see. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Waves. The morning after the tragedy at the Seaside Bandstand, St. Mary Mead awoke to a restless hum, as if the village itself were whispering secrets. The sun rose over the cliffs, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. But the usual tranquility of the village was fractured. In the tea room on the promenade, villagers huddled over cups of Earl Grey, their voices low and urgent. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, recounted the previous night's horror with wide-eyed fervor, while in the churchyard, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price Ridley, declared it an affront to decency. The bandstand, now cordoned off with rope and guarded by a nervous constable, stood like a silent sentinel, its faded blue dome catching the morning light. Hydrangeas swayed gently in the breeze, their petals scattered across the promenade as if mourning the loss of their conductor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage garden, a haven of roses and lavender tucked behind a low stone wall. The air was fragrant with summer blooms, and a blackbird trilled from a nearby apple tree. Her knitting lay on the wrought iron table, a half-finished shawl in soft cream wool. But her hands were still for once, cradling a delicate china teacup. At 74, Miss Marple's appearance, white hair pinned neatly, blue eyes mild behind spectacles, and a lavender cardigan draped over her shoulders, suggested nothing more than a genteel spinster enjoying a quiet morning. Yet her mind was anything but idle, turning over the events of the previous evening like a gardener inspecting soil for weeds. The death of Reginald Hargrove, poisoned by cyanide in front of Raymond, she said. But I find it's the ordinary details that tell the truest story. Tell me, what do you know of Mr. Hargrove's acquaintances? Who might have wished him harm? Raymond leaned forward, eager to share the village gossip he'd gathered at the pub the previous night. Well, there's quite a cast of characters, Aunt Jane. First, there's Victoria Hargrove, his wife. She's in her 40s, elegant as ever. But they say her marriage wasn't all roses. Hargrove had a wandering eye, and Victoria's sharp tongue could cut glass. I heard she was seen arguing with him at the tea room last week, something about money and disgraceful behavior. Motive? Jealousy. Or perhaps she was tired of being humiliated. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Jealousy is a powerful force, Raymond. Like a badly pruned shrub, it can choke everything around it. Who else? Lionel Baxter, the young trumpeter in the band, Raymond continued. He's barely 20, with a boyish face and a nervous habit of tugging his ear. Word is he's up to his neck in gambling debts. Hargrove lent him money once but refused to help again, and they had a shouting match outside the butcher's last week. Lionel's desperate enough to do something rash, don't you think? Desperation makes people careless, Miss Marple mused, sipping her tea. But carelessness leaves traces. Go on. Then there's Eliza Thorne, the librarian. She's in her 50s, prim as a schoolmarm, always with her nose in a book. She and Hargrove were sweethearts years ago, back when they were young. He jilted her for Victoria, and some say she never got over it. She's quiet, but there's a bitterness in her eyes when she speaks of him. Resentment like that can fester. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, though her attention remained on Raymond. Old wounds can be as dangerous as new ones, she said, and the quiet ones often hide the deepest currents. Raymond's voice grew conspiratorial. Next, Dr. Elias Crow, that odd chemist who lives in the cottage on the cliff. He's a recluse, same disputed land. He's a bit of a mystery, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her eyes drifting to a ladybird crawling along a rose petal. People are like my knitting patterns, Raymond, she said. They seem simple enough, but one dropped stitch can unravel the whole design. We must look for the loose threads. As Raymond pondered this, the garden gate creaked, and Dolly Bantry swept in, her bright scarf fluttering like a flag. "Jane, it's dreadful," she exclaimed, sinking into a chair. "The whole village is in a tizzy." Inspector Slacks arrived from the county police, strutting about with his clipboard like he owns the place. He's questioning everyone, but he's got no patience for village nonsense, as he calls it. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Inspector Slack was a familiar figure, a brusque man with a square jaw and a deep distrust of amateur sleuths, especially elderly ones. "He's thorough, Dolly," she said. But thoroughness without insight is like planting seeds in winter. What did you hear at the tea room? Dolly leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Plenty. Mrs. Price Ridley swears she saw Victoria Hargrove filling that flask of Reginald's yesterday morning, right in their kitchen. She says Victoria looked shifty, though you know how she exaggerates. And Mr. Pye, the grocer, says Lionel Baxter was in a state, muttering about making things right with Hargrove. Oh, and there's talk of a button found near the bandstand steps. A sailor's button, they say. Inspector Slack dismissed it as litter, but I think it's suspicious, don't you? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained mild. A button, you say? How curious. Things left behind often tell a story, Dolly, even if the inspector doesn't hear it. The conversation paused as a breeze rustled the roses, carrying the faint sound of waves from the shore. Raymond, restless, stood and paced the path. Aunt Jane, you're awfully calm about this. A man's been murdered. And harm. We mustn't judge by appearances alone. She paused, her gaze distant. The flask interests me. Cyanide is not a common poison. It requires knowledge and opportunity. Who had access, I wonder? And why choose such a public moment? Raymond stopped pacing, his eyes bright. You think it was planned to make a statement? Like a performance? Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps it was meant to look like something else entirely. People are rarely as clever as they think, Raymond, but they are always more complicated. The garden fell quiet, save for the blackbird's song and the distant murmur of the village. Miss Marple's mind worked like her needles, looping and twisting, weaving the fragments of gossip and observation into a pattern only she could see. A poisoned flask, a sailor's button, a jealous wife, a jilted lover, a desperate debtor, a secretive chemist, a mysterious stranger. Each was a stitch in the fabric of St. Mary Mead, and one of them was out of place. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows across the roses, Miss Marple knew that the truth, like her garden, would reveal itself in time, if only she tended it carefully. Chapter 3. Tea and Testimonies. The afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a warm golden haze, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and cobblestone paths. The sea breeze carried a faint tang of salt, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked scones drifting from the vicarage, where a gathering of villagers had assembled for tea. The vicarage, a rambling Georgian house with ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows, stood adjacent to the church, its garden a patchwork of hollyhocks and daisies. Inside, the drawing room was a cozy haven of chintz armchairs, polished oak, and a crackling fire, despite the summer warmth. The occasion was ostensibly a meeting of the parish council, but the real agenda was clear. The shocking murder of Reginald Hargrove at the Seaside Bandstand the previous evening. Miss Jane Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles moving rhythmically in her lap, crafting a cream-colored shawl with the precision dress that clashed with the room's muted tones. Her voice, sharp and authoritative, carried over the murmurs. "I said it before, and I'll say it again," she declared, brandishing a scone as if it were evidence. "This is no accident. Poison. In broad daylight. It's an outrage, a stain on St. Mary Mead's good name." Her eyes darted toward Victoria Hargrove, who sat stiffly on a sofa, her elegant hands folded tightly in her lap. Victoria, in her mid-40s, was a striking woman, with auburn hair swept into a chignon, and a navy dress that spoke of understated wealth. Her face, though pale from grief or perhaps something else, retained a haughty beauty, marred only by the faint lines of strain around her mouth. She had been Reginald Hargrove's wife for 20 years, a union that village gossip painted as turbulent. Whispers of his flirtations and her sharp retorts had long been fodder for tea-room talk. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned toward Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, and lowered her voice, though not enough to escape Miss Marple's ears. "I saw her myself, you know, filling that flask of his yesterday morning. In their kitchen, bold as brass. Looked shifty, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her gaze resting on a vase of hydrangeas on the sideboard, their petals echoing those scattered near the bandstand. "Curious," she murmured to herself, too softly for anyone to hear. She noted Victoria's rigid posture, the way her fingers twisted a lace handkerchief, as if wringing out some hidden truth. Across the room, Lionel Baxter, the band's young trumpeter, fidgeted with his teacup, its saucer rattling faintly. Barely 20, with tousled brown hair and a boyish face flushed with unease, Lionel looked out of place among the older villagers. His tweed jacket was a size too large, likely borrowed from his father, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door, as if longing to escape. Miss Marple recalled Raymond's mention of Lionel's gambling debts and his public leather-bound book, as if it were a shield against the room's scrutiny. Eliza had been Hargrove's sweetheart in their youth, a fact the village had never quite forgotten. Her voice, when she spoke, was clipped but tinged with bitterness. "Books are better companions than men," she said, in response to Mrs. Price Ridley's probing about her presence at the bandstand before the concert. "I was there to arrange chairs, nothing more. Reginald's death is tragic, but I've no part in it." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Eliza, noting the faint tremor in her hands. Old heartbreaks, she knew, could leave scars as deep as any fresh wound. She recalled Dolly Bantry's gossip about Eliza's lingering resentment, and the librarian's solitary life among her books suggested a heart that had never quite mended. Yet there was something else, a flicker of defiance in Eliza's gaze that hinted at secrets unspoken. The vicar, Mr. Clement, a gentleman with a bald head and a nervous smile, attempted to steer the conversation to parish matters, but the murder was an inescapable tide. "We must pray for guidance," he said, his voice drowned by Mrs. Price Ridley's insistence that the police must act swiftly. Inspector Slack, the county detective, had been mentioned frequently, his brusque manner and clipboard already a source of village irritation. He had set up a temporary headquarters at the police station by the harbor, interrogating suspects with a zeal that bordered on impatience. Miss Marple, content to listen, sipped her tea and observed the room's undercurrents. The villagers' chatter was a tapestry of fact and fancy, woven with half-truths and assumptions. She noted how Victoria avoided looking at Eliza, how Lionel's fingers twitched when debts were mentioned, and how Mrs. Price Ridley's gossip carried the weight of conviction, if not evidence. Then, a small detail caught her attention. Dolly Bantry, bustling in with a fresh pot of tea, mentioned the sailor's button found near the bandstand steps. "Inspector Slack called it litter," Dolly said, her scarf fluttering as she poured. "But I think it's odd, don't you, Jane? A button like that, with an anchored..." Price Ridley's account was true. But others might have had opportunity during the concert's chaos. Lionel, fetching instruments. Eliza, arranging chairs. Even Dr. Crow, the reclusive chemist, who knew the properties of such poisons all too well. And what of Silas Reed, lurking near the bandstand? The flask's silver surface, engraved with Hargrove's initials, had been scratched, a detail Miss Marple recalled from the previous night. Had it been tampered with, or was the mark mere wear? The room grew warmer, the fire's glow casting long shadows. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a hydrangea petal that had fallen from the vase, its pink edge curling like a question mark. She thought of the petals near the bandstand, scattered as if by a careless hand. "People leave traces," she murmured to Dolly, who was now discussing the vicar's sermon schedule. "Even when they think they've been clever." Dolly blinked, caught off guard. "Traces, Jane? You mean like the button?" "Among other things," Miss Marple replied, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "The truth is like my garden, Dolly. You must dig gently to find what's hidden beneath the surface." As the tea party wound down, the villagers dispersed, their voices fading into the afternoon. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind weaving a pattern from the day's observations. A wife's tension, a debtor's nerves, a lover's bitterness, a chemist's knowledge, a stranger's shadow. The murder of Reginald Hargrove was a puzzle, its pieces scattered across St. Mary Mead like petals on the promenade. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and patient heart, was already beginning to gather them. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Shore. The late morning sun cast dappled shadows across the promenade of St. Mary Mead, where the sea sparkled like a sheet of polished glass. The village, though still reeling from the murder of Reginald Hargrove at the Seaside Bandstand, carried on with its daily rhythms. Fishermen hauled nets by the harbor, children chased seagulls along the pebbled beach, and the tea room buzzed with whispered theories. The bandstand is collecting shells, but it was a prop for her true purpose: to listen, to watch, and to piece together the threads of the bandstand mystery. The cyanide-laced flask, the sailor's button, the scattered petals, these were fragments of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that even the smallest detail could unravel the truth. Her stroll took her past the bandstand, where a young constable stood guard, his face flushed with the importance of his duty. He tipped his cap as she passed, but his eyes darted nervously toward the village, where Inspector Slack's motor car was parked outside the police station. Slack, a brusque man with a clipboard and a disdain for village meddling, had spent the morning interrogating suspects in a squat gray building by the harbor. His methods, Miss Marple mused, were like a lawnmower over a flower bed. Efficient but indiscriminate, cutting down subtleties along with the weeds. She had no intention of interfering, not yet, but a leisurely walk could reveal as much as any formal inquiry. The bandstand's layout caught her attention as she paused to adjust her hat. Its circular stage, surrounded by ornate iron railings, was elevated just enough to offer a clear view of the audience. But behind the stage, where the conductor stood, were shadowed alcoves formed by the dome's supports, perfect hiding spots for a quick, unseen act. The flask, she recalled, had been in Hargrove's pocket during the concert, but he had set it on a small table during the intermission when the band mingled with the crowd. Anyone could have tampered with it then, slipping cyanide into the strong tea he so famously sipped. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a scuff mark near the table, barely visible in the weathered wood. A careless foot, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Her walk continued toward the pier, where gulls wheeled overhead, and the scent of fish hung heavy. There, she spotted Silas Reed, the mysterious newcomer to St. Mary Mead. The same about that plot. Reed's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his scarred hands working the fishing rod with unnecessary force. A loose thread, Miss Marple thought, filing away his reaction. Silas Reed's grudge, tied to the disputed cliffside land, mirrored Dr. Crow's, suggesting a tangle of motives that warranted closer inspection. As she turned back toward the village, Miss Marple encountered Dolly Bantry, who was hurrying along the promenade with a basket of her own, filled with jam jars for the church fete. Dolly's bright scarf fluttered like a signal flag, and her rosy cheeks glowed with the thrill of gossip. "Jane, you'll never believe what I heard," she exclaimed, falling into step. "There's a letter, an anonymous one, sent to Inspector Slack this morning. It accuses Lionel Baxter of stealing from the band fund. Mrs. Weatherby saw it at the post office, though she swears she didn't read it. Pure nonsense, I'd say, but it's got the village in a flutter." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind turning to Lionel, the young trumpeter with gambling debts and a nervous demeanor. "An anonymous letter," she said softly. "How convenient. Such things are often more about misdirection than truth, Dolly. Like planting weeds to hide a rose." Dolly blinked, then laughed. "You and your gardening metaphors, Jane. But you're right, it's suspicious. And there's more. Victoria Hargrove told the inspector she saw Eliza Thorne near the flask during the intermission. Said Eliza was fussing with the table, though Eliza denies it. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Accusations are like shadows, Dolly. They shift depending on the light. We must see who casts them and why." She recalled Eliza Thorne's prim demeanor at the vicarage tea, her bitterness toward Hargrove thinly veiled. Victoria's claim, if true, pointed to opportunity, but it also felt like a stitch pulled too tight, threatening to unravel the pattern. Was Victoria deflecting suspicion, or had Eliza truly been near the flask? As they neared the tea room, the conversation turned to "Talk, Mrs. Price Ridley," she said, her tone mild. "But it's the quiet facts that often speak loudest." The promenade grew busier as villagers gathered, their voices a chorus of speculation. Miss Marple paused by a bench, her basket resting on her arm as she surveyed the bandstand from a distance. The constable was now joined by Inspector Slack, who strode about with his clipboard, barking orders. His investigation, she knew, would focus on the obvious: motives, alibis, fingerprints. But Miss Marple's approach was different. She saw the village as a tapestry, its threads woven from everyday moments. A glance, a word, a petal out of place. The sailor's button, dismissed as litter, nagged at her thoughts. Had it fallen from Silas Reed's coat, or was it planted to mislead? And the flask's scratched engraving, had it been tampered with before the concert, or during the intermission's chaos? As the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple's walk brought her back to the bandstand's edge, where a hydrangea petal caught her eye, trapped in a crack in the steps. She bent to retrieve it, her fingers brushing the rough wood. The petal was fresh, its pink edge vibrant, unlike the faded ones scattered elsewhere. "Curious," she murmured, tucking it into her basket. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, But Miss Marple knew that small things often held the key to larger truths. Dolly, catching up, noticed the gesture. "Jane, you're not collecting petals now, are you? What's that got to do with anything?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gleaming with quiet purpose. "Everything has its place, Dolly. Even a petal. It's when things are out of place that we must pay attention." She straightened, her gaze sweeping the promenade, where villagers moved like figures in a play, each with their own secrets and stories. The murder of Reginald Hargrove was a knot in the fabric of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her patient hands and sharper mind, was already beginning to tease it apart. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Past. The on the bridge of her nose. She carried a small stack of books to return, gardening manuals, and a volume on local history, though her true errand was far more intriguing. The cyanide poisoning at the bandstand had woven a web of suspicion through St. Mary Mead, ensnaring suspects like Victoria Hargrove, Lionel Baxter, Dr. Elias Crow, and Silas Reed. But Eliza Thorne, the prim librarian with a jilted past, intrigued Miss Marple most. Old romances she knew could echo through the years like whispers in an empty hall, stirring emotions long buried. Eliza stood behind the circulation desk, her spectacles glinting as she stamped a book with precise motions. In her 50s, she was a figure of quiet efficiency, graying hair in a bun, a high-necked blouse buttoned to the throat, and a tweed skirt that spoke of practicality over fashion. Her face, lined with the subtle marks of solitude, held a wistfulness that Miss Marple had noted at the vicarage tea. As Miss Marple approached, Eliza looked up, her expression tightening slightly. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped but polite. "Returning those already? You do get through them quickly." Miss Marple smiled warmly, placing the books on the desk. "I find reading passes the time pleasantly, Miss Thorne, especially on days like these with so much excitement in the village." She paused, her eyes drifting to a vase of hydrangeas on the desk, petals again, pink and delicate, mirroring those near the bandstand. "Such dreadful business about Mr. Hargrove. You must have known him well, in your youth." Eliza's stamp paused mid-air, her knuckles whitening. She set it down carefully, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "That was a lifetime ago," she replied, her tone brittle. "We were young fools, Reginald and I. He promised the world, but chose money and ambition instead. Victoria was his prize, or so he thought." A faint bitterness crept into her words, like ink bleeding through paper. "I moved on, of course. Books don't betray you." Your time, Miss Thorne." As she turned to leave, she glimpsed a small vial on the shelf behind the desk. Ink, perhaps? Or something else? No, just a librarian's tool. But in a village touched by poison, even innocence cast shadows. Outside, the promenade bustled gently, the sea's rhythm a constant backdrop. Miss Marple's mind turned over Eliza's words. The jilted lover, the bitterness confessed. It was a motive as old as time, but was it the truth? Victoria's accusation of seeing Eliza near the flask lingered like a fog. Yet accusations were often veils for one's own guilt. Meanwhile, across the village at the police station, Inspector Slack pursued his own path with bulldog tenacity. The squat harbor building, with its peeling paint and salty air, hummed with activity. Slack, a stocky man in his 40s with a clipboard perpetually in hand, paced the interview room. his square jaw set in determination. He had arrested Lionel Baxter that morning, the young trumpeter dragged in protesting his innocence. Lionel sat slumped in a wooden chair, his boyish face pale and his hands fidgeting with a loose thread on his jacket. "I didn't do it, Inspector," Lionel insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. "The cyanide in my shed, it's for rats. Garden pests, that's all. Mr. Hargrove knew about my debts, but he was helping me, not threatening." Slack leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Helping, was he? Witnesses heard you arguing last week, Baxter, and that anonymous letter about band funds missing points right to you. Motive, opportunity. You were on stage all evening." Lionel's eyes welled with tears, but he shook his head vehemently. "I paid him back. Ask anyone. It was a misunderstanding." Miss Marple, learning of the arrest later from Dolly Bantry, frowned inwardly. Too convenient, she thought. The cyanide traces, the letter, like a red herring dangled before a fox, meant to divert the hunt. Dolly had shared the news over a quick cup of tea at Miss Marple's cottage, her scarf askew in her agitation. Marple took a solitary walk to the cliffs, the path winding through bracken and wildflowers. The wind whipped her cardigan, carrying echoes of the bandmaster's final gasp. She thought of Silas Reed's fishing spot, Victoria's shifty flask handling, and now Lionel's arrest, a false note in the symphony. The village atmosphere remained warm. Neighbors sharing scones at the bakery and sympathies over garden fences, but undercurrents swirled. Mrs. Price Ridley gossiped at the post office about Crow's potions, while children played innocently near the bandstand, oblivious to the rope barrier. In her cottage that night, Miss Marple knitted by the fire, the flames dancing like unspoken secrets. Lionel's arrest was a misstep, the cyanide too obvious. The real killer had access to Crow's lab, perhaps, or knowledge of poisons gleaned from books. Eliza's domain? The tonics could hide cyanide's bitterness, a clever veil. And the sailor's button, still dismissed yet nagging like a thorn. The village settled into dusk, the sea whispering on the shore. St. Mary Mead's community, with its fetes and friendships, endured. But Miss Marple knew the echoes of the past. Jealousy, debt, betrayal were amplifying. Lionel, freed on bail by morning, would add another layer. But the pattern was emerging. A murder masked in everyday elixir. Suspects intertwined like vines on the cliffs. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind delving deeper. Human nature, she reflected, was like those dusty library tomes, full of forgotten chapters, waiting for the right reader to turn the page. And in St. Mary Mead, the next revelation was but a whisper away. Chapter 6. Tides of Deception. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose as the village settled into the gentle hum of early evening. The promenade, with its pebbled beach and whispering waves, carried a deceptive calm, as if the sea could wash away scratched flask, the hydrangea petals. These were fragments of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that deception often hid in the ordinary, like a weed among roses. Her nephew, Raymond West, sprawled in an armchair across from her, his tweed jacket rumpled from a day of amateur sleuthing. His dark hair fell over his forehead as he waved a hand dramatically. "Aunt Jane, this case is maddening." Inspector Slack's chasing his own tail. First Lionel. Now he's eyeing Silas Reed. And the village is buzzing with nonsense. Did you hear about the love letter? Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharpening. A love letter, Raymond. Do tell. He leaned forward, his voice conspiratorial. Found in Hargrove's desk at home, tucked inside a band score. It's from him to an unknown woman, full of flowery promises. My heart is yours, that sort of thing. Victoria swears it proves he was unfaithful, but she won't say who the woman is. The inspector thinks it's a motive for her jealousy, but I think it's a distraction. What do you make of it? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her lips pursing thoughtfully. A letter like that can be a beacon or a shadow, Raymond. It may light the way to the truth or lead us astray. Who found it, I wonder, and when? She suspected a planted clue, a red herring cast to muddy the waters. Victoria Hargrove's accusation against Eliza Thorne, claiming she saw the librarian near the flask, already felt like a misdirection, and this letter added another layer of deception. The village's gossip had grown wilder since Lionel Baxter's release on bail, his arrest for cyanide possession deemed too flimsy by the magistrate. Now attention turned to Silas Reed, the enigmatic sailor with the scarred face and a limp. A fisherman had reported seeing him near the bandstand just before the concert, his weathered coat flapping in the wind. When questioned, Reed claimed he was merely admiring the view. But his evasive answers and solitary habits fueled suspicion. Inspector Slack, with his bulldog tenacity, had hauled him in for questioning. The crow at the bandstand a week ago, carrying a vial, suspicious, she called it. And everyone knows his laboratory's full of chemicals. Mrs. Price Ridley's been telling the tea room that Crow's a mad scientist, brewing death in his cottage. Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles clicking softly. Dr. Crow's knowledge is no secret, but knowledge alone doesn't make a murderer. And Miss Thorne's eagerness to point fingers is curious. She recalled Eliza's bitterness at the library, her confession of a jilted romance with Hargrove. Was her accusation against Crow genuine, or another thread of deception meant to deflect scrutiny? The librarian's prim exterior hid a heart still raw, and Miss Marple knew that old wounds could spur reckless acts. The evening deepened, and Miss Marple decided to take a stroll to clear her thoughts. The village was quiet, save for the distant clink of glasses from the pub and the soft lap of waves against the shore. She walked toward the cliffs, where Dr. Crow's cottage perched like a sentinel, its windows glowing faintly. The chemist, a reclusive man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and a gaunt face, was an enigma even to St. Mary Mead's gossips. His dispute with Hargrove over the cliffside land, coupled with his access to cyanide, made him a plausible suspect. But Miss Marple sensed a deeper story. Had Crow supplied the tonic that masked the poison, or was he merely a convenient scapegoat? As she passed the bandstand, now a ghostly silhouette in the dusk, Miss Marple paused to study its layout once more. The alcoves behind the stage, shadowed and discreet, offered cover for a swift act of tampering. The flask, left briefly on the table during the intermission, was vulnerable to any hand. Victoria's, Eliza's, Lionel's, even Crow's or Reed's. But the poison's timing puzzled her. Cyanide acted swiftly, yet Hargrove had sipped from the flask earlier without harm. Was the poison added mid-concert? Or had it been in the flask all along, disguised by some clever means? Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustle near the hydrangeas. Turning, Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking like a metronome. Theories are like half-finished patterns, Raymond. They look promising until you see the flaws. Human nature is predictable, you know, like the vicar's sermons, full of familiar twists, but always with a surprise at the end. Dolly laughed, buttering a scone. You're impossible, Jane. But what about Victoria? That letter's got her in a state. She's telling everyone Hargrove betrayed her. And yet, she's the one who filled his flask. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but piercing. But what we see is not always what is. The letter, the accusations, the button, they're like ripples on the surface. The truth lies deeper, in the currents beneath. As the fire burned low, the village settled into night, its warm community spirit tempered by whispers of betrayal. The love letter, Eliza's accusations, Silas's lurking presence, all were tides of deception, pulling the investigation in circles. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and patient heart, saw the pattern emerging. A killer who wove lies as deftly as she wove wool, hiding in plain sight among St. Mary Mead's familiar faces. Chapter 7. Glimmers in the Mist. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a soft, silvery veil that softened the edges of its thatched cottages and winding lanes. The sea, visible from the cliffs, murmured restlessly, its waves a quiet counterpoint to the unease that had settled over the community since Reginald Hargrove's murder at the Seaside Bandstand. The bandstand itself, still cordoned off with sagging rope, stood like a forgotten monument, its faded blue dome glistening with dew. Hydrangeas drooped under the weight of the mist, their scattered petals clinging to the steps like remnants of a broken promise. In the village, life continued. Bakers kneaded dough, fishermen mended nets, but the air carried a tension, as if St. Mary Mead held its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. Scarf a splash of color against the gray morning. Inspector Slack's been poking about Dr. Crow's cottage. And you'll never guess, Mrs. Price Ridley says she overheard Victoria Hargrove arguing with Crow last month. Something about debts owed. And that sailor's button. It's got everyone talking about Silas Reed again. Miss Marple set down her secateurs, her lips pursing thoughtfully. Debts and buttons, Dolly. The village is full of stories, but we must find the ones that fit. She recalled the button found near the bandstand steps and dismissed by Inspector Slack as litter. Its anchor design pointed to Silas Reed, but his claim of losing it weeks ago rang oddly true, a planted clue, perhaps, to steer suspicion. And Victoria's argument with Crow added a new stitch to the pattern, one that warranted closer inspection. Determined to tug at these threads, Miss Marple made her way to the village center, where the weekly market bustled despite the mist. Stalls lined the cobblestone square, offering jams, knitted scarves, and fresh fish, their vendors exchanging gossip as freely as coins. She paused by Mr. Pye's grocery stall, where the grocer, a wiry man with a penchant for exaggeration, was regaling a customer with tales of Crow's sinister laboratory. "Chemicals bubbling all hours," Mr. Pye said, wiping his hands on his apron. "And Hargrove was always there fetching tonics. I wouldn't trust a drop of what that man brews." Miss Marple smiled politely, her eyes catching a glimpse of Lionel Baxter across the square. The young trumpeter, freed on bail after his brief arrest, stood by a flower stall, his boyish face pale and his hands stuffed in his pockets. She approached with her usual air of gentle curiosity, her basket swinging lightly. "Good morning, Lionel," she said, pausing to admire a bunch of daisies. "You must be relieved to be out and about?" Lionel started, his eyes darting nervously. "Miss Marple," he stammered, tugging at his ear. "I didn't do it, I swear. The cyanide in my shed was for rats, not murder." His voice cracked and he lowered it, glancing around. Mr. Hargrove knew a light to grow. As she moved on, her mind turned over his confession. Hargrove's blackmail was a new thread tying Lionel to Crow's tonics and deepening the web of motives. But Lionel's openness suggested fear more than guilt, and the cyanide in his shed felt too conveniently placed. Her next stop was Dr. Crow's cottage, perched on the cliffs like a hermit's retreat. The path wound through bracken and wildflowers, the mist clinging to her cardigan as she climbed. Crow, a gaunt man in his 60s with white hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, opened the door reluctantly, his laboratory visible behind him, a cluttered space of glass vials and bubbling flasks. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice dry as parchment. "I suppose you're here about Hargrove. The whole village seems to think I'm brewing poison for sport." "Not at all, Dr. Crow," she replied, her tone disarming. "I'm merely curious about those tonics you made for him. For his nerves, I believe?" Crow's eyes narrowed, but he gestured her inside. The air smelled of chemicals and herbs, and a shelf held rows of labeled bottles. None, Miss Marple noted, marked as cyanide, though she knew such a substance could be hidden in plain sight. "Hargrove was a nuisance," Crow admitted, crossing his arms. "Always pestering for stronger tonics, claiming his heart was weak. I gave him harmless compounds, bitter herbs mostly. But he was in debt to me, you know. Never paid for half the bottles." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to a vial on the workbench, its contents a murky green. "And cyanide, Dr. Crow? You have access, I presume?" He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Of course I do. It's common in chemical work, pest control, photography. But I keep it locked away. If you're implying I poisoned him, you're as misguided as that fool Slack." His indignation seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted a tremor in his hand, a crack in his composure. As she left the cottage, a crucial discovery dawned. Returning to the bandstand, she bent to examine the steps, where the sailor's letter is a shadow, Raymond. It distracts from the light. I suspect Victoria knows more than she says. And this petal, she held it up, its pink edge catching the light. Links to her garden. We're narrowing the threads, my dear. The suspects were fewer now. Victoria, with her jealousy and access to the flask, Crow with his chemicals and grudge, and Silas Reed, whose button and lurking presence remained unexplained. The village's warmth, neighbors sharing tea, children playing by the shore, cloaked a darker truth. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, weaving a pattern from the mist. A killer who used the bandstand stage not just for murder, but for a performance of deception that was only now coming into focus. Chapter 8. Nets Tightening. The afternoon sun broke through the morning's mist, bathing St. Mary Mead in a warm golden light that danced across the cobblestone lanes and thatched roofs. The sea sparkled beyond the cliffs, its waves a gentle murmur, but the village's tranquility was a fragile veneer, stretched thin by the unresolved murder of Reginald Hargrove at the Seaside Bandstand. The bandstand itself, still roped off like a stage frozen in time, stood silent, its faded blue dome gleaming faintly. Hydrangea petals, scattered by the breeze, clung to its steps, a quiet reminder of the poison that had silenced the conductor's baton. In the tea room, the bakery, and the churchyard, villagers exchanged hushed theories, their voices weaving a tapestry of suspicion that hung heavy over St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan buttoned against a lingering chill, sat in her cottage's cozy drawing room, preparing for an impromptu gathering she had arranged. At 74, her white hair pinned neatly, and her blue eyes sharp behind spectacles, she was the picture of a harmless spinster, her knitting needles clicking softly as they shaped a cream-colored shawl. But beneath her gentle exterior, her mind was a loom, weaving the threads of Hargrove's murder into a clearer pattern. The cyanide-laced flask, the sailor's button, the hydrangea petal, the love letter, and the web of accusations. Navy dress impeccable despite the strain in her eyes. At 45, she carried herself with the elegance of a woman accustomed to scrutiny, but her hands twisted a lace handkerchief betraying her nerves. Lionel Baxter followed, his boyish face pale and his tweed jacket rumpled, his eyes darting as if expecting arrest at any moment. Eliza Thorne, prim in her spectacles and high-necked blouse, clutched a book as if it were a talisman, her lips pressed into a thin line. Dr. Elias Crow, gaunt and white-haired, entered with a scowl, his chemist's hands tucked into his pockets. Silas Reed, the scarred sailor, limped in last, his weathered coat buttoned tightly, his eyes scanning the room like a man on watch. Miss Marple greeted them with her usual warmth, pouring tea with steady hands. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice as soothing as the ticking of the mantel clock. "The fete is such a village tradition, but I confess, recent events weigh heavily. Perhaps we might share our thoughts on poor Mr. Hargrove's passing." The room tensed, teacups clinking against saucers. Victoria spoke first, her voice sharp. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple. Reginald was difficult, but no one deserves such a fate. I told the inspector I saw Eliza near the flask during the intermission, fussing with the table, as if she had a purpose." Her eyes flicked to Eliza, who stiffened. Eliza's spectacles flashed as she leaned forward. "That's nonsense, Victoria, and you know it. I was arranging chairs, nothing more. If anyone had reason to harm Reginald, it was you. His affairs were no secret, and you filled that flask yourself." Her voice trembled with old resentment, the echo of a jilted heart. Lionel, his face flushing, set down his cup with a rattle. "I didn't do it, I swear. Mr. Hargrove blackmailed me over a silly mistake, shillings from the band fund years ago. But I'd never poison him. The cyanide in my shed was for rats, not murder." His desperation hung in the air, drawing a skeptical glance against Eliza felt rehearsed. Eliza's bitterness too raw to be feigned. Lionel's confession of blackmail tied him to Crow's tonics, but his openness suggested innocence. Crow's defensiveness hinted at knowledge, if not guilt, and Silas's alibi, if true, cleared him, unless the button was indeed planted. As the tea cooled, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the flask itself. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said mildly. "How such a small thing could hold such a deadly secret. Cyanide acts swiftly, yet Mr. Hargrove sipped from his flask earlier without harm. It suggests the poison was added during the intermission, when the bandstand was crowded. Who among you was near the stage then?" The room fell silent, eyes darting. Victoria's handkerchief twisted tighter. "I was with the audience," she said quickly. "I didn't go near the stage." Eliza adjusted her spectacles. "I was back and forth, but only to tidy chairs. I didn't touch the flask." Lionel tugged at his ear. "I was fetching my trumpet case, but I didn't see anything odd." Crow shrugged. "I was in the crowd watching the band. I've no interest in Hargrove's habits. Silas grunted. I was at the pub by then. Ask the barman. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. The intermission was the key, a moment of chaos when a hand could slip unnoticed to the flask. The hydrangea petal from Victoria's garden, the scratched engraving, the love letter, all pointed to someone close, someone with access and motive. Victoria's jealousy, fueled by Hargrove's infidelity, was compelling. But Crow's chemical expertise and Silas's grudge lingered like shadows. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple escorted her guests to the garden gate, her eyes catching a final detail. A faint stain on Victoria's sleeve, barely visible, like the residue of a spilled tonic. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew small things could unravel great secrets. Thank you all, she said, unseen hand, their motives and opportunities converging like waves on the bandstand's shore. Chapter 9. The Crescendo of Truth. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silvery glow across the cliffs and the restless sea beyond. The village, with its thatched cottages and sleeping gardens, seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The Seaside Bandstand, no longer cordoned but still somber, stood like a silent stage under the starlit sky, its faded blue dome ghostly in the moonlight. Hydrangea petals, scattered by the evening breeze, lay like forgotten notes around its steps, a poignant reminder of the tragedy that had silenced Reginald Hargrove's baton. The village's cozy warmth, neighbors sharing tea, children's laughter by the shore, had given way to an undercurrent of anticipation. For Miss Jane Marple had invited the key suspects to a gathering at the bandstand, determined to bring the truth to light. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the bandstand, her slight figure wrapped in a lavender cardigan, her white hair glowing faintly under a modest hat. At 74, her mild blue eyes and gentle demeanor belied the razor-sharp mind that had unraveled countless village secrets. Her knitting was left at home tonight, her hands instead clasped calmly, as if holding the threads of the mystery itself. The cyanide-laced flask, the sailor's button, the hydrangea petal, the love letter, and the accusations that had tangled St. Mary Mead in suspicion. The suspects: Victoria Hargrove, Lionel Baxter, Eliza Thorne, Dr. Elias Crow, and Silas Reed, stood in a loose semicircle on the stage, their faces etched with unease under the constable's lantern light. Inspector Slack, clipboard in hand, hovered nearby, his square jaw set but his eyes betraying a grudging respect for the elderly spinster who had outpaced his investigation. Miss Marple's voice, soft yet clear, cut through the night air like a bell. Good evening, all. It's fitting we gather Dr. Crow's chemicals, Mr. Baxter's debts, and Mr. Reed's grudge raised suspicions. A love letter suggested infidelity. A button hinted at a sailor's presence. But these are shadows, cast to obscure the truth. She stepped forward, her eyes sweeping the group. Let us start with the flask. It was Mr. Hargrove's habit to sip his strong tea, yet he did so early in the concert without harm. The poison struck only after the intermission, when the flask was left on the bandstand table. Who had access? Mrs. Hargrove, who filled it that morning, Miss Thorne, arranging chairs nearby, Mr. Baxter, fetching his trumpet case, Dr. Crow in the crowd, Mr. Reed, seen lurking earlier. But opportunity alone is not enough. Victoria's voice trembled as she interrupted. I filled the flask with tea as always. I'd never harm Reginald, despite his betrayals. Her eyes flicked to Eliza, a spark of accusation. Eliza bristled, her spectacles flashing. Don't pin this on me, Victoria. You knew about his affairs. You had every reason to be furious. I was nowhere near that flask during the intermission. Lionel's voice cracked. I didn't touch it either. I was in debt, yes, and he blackmailed me. But I didn't kill him. Crow's dry voice cut in. If it's poison you're after, look to Mrs. Hargrove's garden. Cyanide's not hard to come by for someone desperate. Silas Reed growled. And that button's not mine. Someone planted it to frame me. I was at the pub, as my receipt proves. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the clamor. Let us consider the clues. A sailor's button found near the steps pointed to Mr. Reed. But his alibi holds and the button was too conveniently placed. A love letter found in Mr. Hargrove's desk suggested infidelity, but its timing, discovered after his death, smells of fabric during the intermission, when the crowd provided cover. Eliza's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. Reginald and we talked, yes, but it was nothing. Just memories, nothing more. Miss Marple nodded. Yet, to Mrs. Hargrove, it was betrayal. She planted the button to implicate Mr. Reed, whose land dispute made him a convenient scapegoat. The love letter was forged, placed to fuel suspicion of infidelity and divert attention. But the pedal, the scratch, the timing, they all point to you, Mrs. Hargrove. Victoria's composure shattered, her face crumpling as she sank onto a bench. I couldn't bear it, she sobbed. He was mine, and he turned to her again. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted him to stop. Her confession spilled like a broken dam, admitting the theft of cyanide, the switch of flasks, the careful planting of false clues. Inspector Slack, stunned, stepped forward, his clipboard forgotten. Mrs. Hargrove, you're under arrest, he said, his voice gruff but tinged with awe at Miss Marple's unraveling of the case. The constable moved to escort Victoria, whose sobs echoed in the night. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her resolve remained. Human nature is a complex score, she said quietly to the group. Love and jealousy can play the same notes, but with very different intent. Mrs. Hargrove chose a deadly refrain. As the suspects dispersed, their faces a mix of relief and shock, the bandstand stood silent once more. The sea whispered on, indifferent to the drama, and Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the hydrangeas. The truth had emerged, not with a flourish, but with the quiet clarity of a melody resolved, its notes falling into place under the moonlight. Chapter 10. Tea and Tranquility. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a soft golden light across the village's thatched cottages, cobblestone lanes, and blooming gardens. The sea beyond the cliffs sparkled like a promise of renewal, shaping a cream-colored shawl. But her true work was done. She had unraveled the mystery of Reginald Hargrove's murder, exposing Victoria's jealousy-driven act of poisoning. Now, as the village settled back into its familiar warmth, she welcomed her nephew, Raymond West, and her friend Dolly Bantry for a morning tea, a ritual as comforting as the resolution she was about to share. The garden was a haven of tranquility, with bees humming among the flowers and a blackbird trilling from an apple tree. Raymond, his tweed jacket slightly rumpled, sprawled in a chair, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he gestured animatedly. "Aunt Jane, you're a marvel," he exclaimed, reaching for a scone. "Last night at the bandstand, unmasking Victoria like that, with Inspector Slack gaping like a fish. How did you piece it all together? I thought Eliza or Crow was the culprit for sure." Dolly Bantry, her bright scarf fluttering like a flag, leaned forward, her rosy cheeks aglow with curiosity. "Yes, Jane, do tell. I was certain it was Silas Reed with that sailor's button, or maybe Lionel with his debts. But Victoria, how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea with steady hands, the china cups clinking softly. "It was all in the details, my dears," she said, her voice as gentle as the breeze. "Murder, you see, is like a badly knitted pattern. One loose stitch can unravel the whole design. The truth lay in the everyday observations, the small things we overlook because they seem so ordinary." She set down the teapot, her eyes drifting to a rose bush heavy with blooms. "Let us start with the flask. Mr. Hargrove's habit of sipping his strong tea was well known, but he drank from it early in the concert without harm. The cyanide struck only after the intermission, suggesting the poison was added then, when the flask was left on the bandstand table. Victoria, as his wife, filled it that morning, giving her the first opportunity. But opportunity alone wasn't enough. Raymond leaned forward, his eyes bright. "But the love letter, it pointed to misdirection, Dolly. Its anchor design suggested Silas, but his alibi, a pub receipt from the night of the concert, was ironclad. He claimed to have lost it weeks before, and I believed him. The button was planted near the bandstand steps, likely by Victoria, to cast suspicion on a man whose land dispute with Hargrove made him a plausible scapegoat. It was a clever touch, but too deliberate, like a stitch sewn too tightly." She sipped her tea, the steam curling in the morning air. "Then there was the hydrangea petal, found in a crack near the bandstand. It matched those in Victoria's garden, where she tended her flowers with pride. Petals don't travel far without a hand to carry them. And Victoria was near the stage during the intermission, mingling with the crowd. She had the chance to switch the flask, perhaps replacing it with one laced with cyanide, which she'd procured from Dr. Crow's laboratory during a visit under the guise of settling debts." Raymond's eyes widened. "Crow's laboratory, so he was involved?" "Not as a murderer," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "Dr. Crow supplied Hargrove with tonics, harmless, bitter herbs for his nerves. But his laboratory held cyanide, common for chemical work, and Victoria, during her visit, could have taken a small amount. Crow's grudge over the cliffside land made him a convenient suspect, and Eliza's accusation against him, fueled by her own bitterness, added to the confusion. But Crow's indignation was genuine. He had no reason to kill Hargrove, only to resent him." Dolly set down her cup, her scarf slipping slightly. "And Lionel?" The poor boy with his debts and that cyanide in his shed. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Lionel was another victim of misdirection. His gambling debts and Hargrove's blackmail over a youthful theft gave him a motive, but his openness about it suggested fear, not guilt. The cyanide in his shed, used for rats, was too conveniently found, likely placed there to frame him. Victoria, not hidden beneath. Victoria's jealousy, rooted in a marriage strained by Hargrove's charm and betrayals, drove her to a desperate act. She wove a web of false clues, the letter, the button, the accusations, to hide her guilt. But the truth always leaves traces. Dolly sighed, reaching for another scone. Poor Victoria. To think she sat at your tea, Jane, all the while knowing what she'd done. And now she's with Inspector Slack, facing justice. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice softening. But justice, like a garden, restores balance. St. Mary Mead will heal, as it always does. She glanced toward the village where the bandstand was being prepared for a new concert, its stage swept clean of petals and pain. Children laughed by the shore, neighbors shared gossip over fences, and the sea whispered on, indifferent to human folly. As the tea cooled, Raymond leaned back, his eyes bright with admiration. You're a wonder, Aunt Jane. The village owes you a debt, though I suspect you'll just ask for a new rosebush. Miss Marple chuckled, her needles clicking like a metronome. A rosebush would be lovely, Raymond, but the real reward is seeing the pattern complete, the stitches aligned. Now, do have another scone. The garden fell quiet, save for the blackbird's song and the distant crash of waves. St. Mary Mead, with its warm community and gentle rhythms, had weathered the storm of murder, its secrets laid bare by an elderly spinster who saw more than most. As the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her roses, content in the knowledge that even the darkest deeds could be unraveled by the light of careful observation.